Good morning, good evening, good night, depending on where you are in the world, to everybody for coming here today. My name is James Stapleton. I'm the Senior Strategic Advisor at CGIAR for Advocacy. And I'm here today as your moderator on the second of a webinar series on COP29 to COP30, on the road to COP29 to COP30, and this on the new Collective Quantified Goal in Climate Finance. Before I introduce you to our speakers, I want to say a few words about climate finance. I think that, you're all on here and you're all interested, so you have a good idea. At COP29, we had the tripling of the commitment from 100 billion annually from developed nations to 300 billion, with the possibility of scaling to 1.3 trillion a year from all financial sources. This is a significant step up. And it reflects, if you like, the economic importance, so not just the economic importance, but also the economic importance of the agri-food sector, which represents 1/6 of the global economy and nearly 50% of economies in low-income countries, and up to 2/3 of the labor force in low-income countries, with huge potential, not just for climate resilience, but also for sustainable development. But the financial reality today is that despite spending $650 billion a year in annual supports to agriculture, agri-food systems generate up to $12 trillion a year in hidden costs, environmental costs and other costs. There's a real opportunity to not just to achieve our climate goals, but also, as I said, to achieve our development goals with an increase in agri-food finance. Agricultural systems, agri-food systems we know they're both vulnerable, but they also offer a huge amount of potential for triple wins in food security and nutrition, climate resilience, and mitigation, with the opportunities of creating jobs and driving inclusive growth. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to bring you to today, what we're doing today. As I said, in our second webinar, we're going to examine the significance of the finance outcome from last year and how it falls short of our estimated needs, and what are the implications for the agri-food sector. And here to speak to you today are, as I said, three experts, or four experts, in fact, three speakers, and then a representative from a country who will give closing remarks. So the three speakers are Haseb Bakhtari from the Climate Focus, who will talk about public climate finance food systems. Julia Galbiati from the FAO, Senior Natural Resources Officer from the FAO, who will speak about climate-related financial mechanisms. Dr. Pedro Chiambe from the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAR on mobilizing finance for locally led adaptation, with closing remarks by Carol Franco Bellini from the Dominican Republic's Ministry of Environment. So I'm going to start with you, Haseb. I'm just going to... Discussions on the National Quantified Collective Goal on climate finance often focus on scaling finance. But how do we ensure that finance is accessible, effective, and equitably distributed, particularly for the most vulnerable? Haseb, over to you.
Thank you so much, James. Very glad to be here, and welcome to all participants in this webinar. As you mentioned in the beginning, one of your remarks, that the NCQG is not ambitious. It was a political compromise. It's clear that the 300 billion per year is not sufficient to meet the Paris Agreement goals, whether it's mitigation or adaptation. It's not even enough to meet the needs of the agriculture and food systems, as you mentioned, because just to transform our food systems to meet the food security targets and goals, sustainable development goals, climate mitigation, adaptation, we need something between 350 to 1.4 trillion, 350 billion to 1.4 trillion dollars a year. So it's not ambitious enough. It's also not clear. It's quite vague in details, because it doesn't give any details on the targets for different sectors. How much money do we need for agriculture and food system, but also for the energy sector, transport sector, and so on. it also does not provide details on how this money will be mobilized and who will be responsible for that. But fortunately, the decision included the roadmap that you mentioned, the Baku to Belém roadmap to 1.3 trillion, which will be raised from public and private sources. And the COP29 presidency, so Azerbaijan, and COP30 presidency, Brazil, are responsible to come up with a roadmap, with this roadmap between now and COP30, and then Belém, it should be decided. So there is an opportunity to influence this process, and there is an opportunity to make the climate finance under the NCQG more accessible and effective, and make sure that it's equitably distributed. But I'm afraid the window is short, and the two COP presidency just in February published an invitation to all civil society, private sector, and others to provide inputs on how they can develop this roadmap, the Baku to Belém roadmap to 1.3 trillion, what thematic issues they should be including in the roadmap, what are some of the experiences that they have faced in the past that can be considered in this, what kind of instruments, financial instruments they should be considering. So hopefully between now and Belém, as and all concerned citizens and civil society organizations can provide input. But at the end of it, I think the COP presidencies, both COP presidencies, must consider and put farmers, especially small scale agricultural farmers, family farmers, at the heart of finance plans to raise 1.3 trillion. Because as you mentioned, the food system's climate impact, the food system's adaptation need, and the food system's contribution to the global economic development makes it at the heart of any effort to address the several crises that are converging right now, whether it's biodiversity or climate mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development. So food system must be at the heart, farmers must be at the heart. They should clearly define the various sectors the finance will be going, how much, and what kind of activities, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, or both, will be going, and what the roadmap will provide in terms of recommendations on how the current international climate finance mechanisms, whether it's the Green Climate Global Environmental Facility or Green Climate Fund, GCF, GEF, how they need to be reformed to make them more accessible to farmers, but also how they can be reformed to increase climate finance to agriculture and food system projects overall. So while there is an invitation from COP presidencies to provide input, at the end it's on them to critically consider all the possibilities to increase finance for food system and agriculture and food systems, as well as small scale farmers, but also provide bring them to the table, part of the discussion, part of the conversation, part of the decision making going to the COP30. And most importantly, I think a big part of this climate finance that will be hopefully set aside or allocated to agriculture and food system should be in the form of grants and not loans, because the climate crisis that we are in are not the responsibility or they're not, it's not because of farmers in the first place, because of smallholder farmers. It's not because of practice in the global south countries. So thinking about the historical responsibility of countries, it's important that, and the current debt burden that a lot of these global south countries are under, it is crucial that a bulk of this finance within the 1.3 trillion in the roadmap is in form of grants and maybe concessional loans, but no debt creating instruments, for example, should be included. I'll stop there. Happy to go into more details. Thanks. Back to you, James.
Thanks, Asif. Before I go on to Julia, I just want to pick up on that. Is there anything that we've learned from these existing financial mechanisms that needs to inform the design? You spoke about not adding more debt. You spoke about are there any other specifics, maybe about some of these financial mechanisms that we've learned that we think that really needs to inform this negotiation process, this roadmap?
Yes, certainly. One thing is making these financial mechanisms more accessible. So right now, both GEF and GCF have their mandates. So they work with governments, and the money goes through the governments, the central governments in these countries, and through the accredited agencies and implementing partners of those accredited agencies. And these are all big NGOs or banks, public banks, and even private banks in some cases. And what happens in most cases is that by the time the money is going to farmers or to the beneficiaries on the ground, there's a huge time lag. That it takes years for money to go from a project approval to actual implementation, especially in this rapidly changing climate. By then, the climate impacts have already, for example, impacted farmers. So the realities on the ground change from when the project is designed to when it's being implemented. That means that we need to shorten this project approval process and time. And we need to make it easier for smallholder farmer organizations to be able to access these sources of finance. Right now, they cannot directly access finance, for example. Like I said, it's mostly the big NGOs and other accredited agencies that can finance. Of course, these NGOs in some cases include farmers as partners, but these are few cases here and there, and it's not necessarily the norm. To allow farmers to actually implement mitigation or adaptation practices on the ground as needed and in short time frame, they need to access finance directly and not as just passive beneficiaries of project activities developed by other organizations. There are some efforts by both GEF and GCF to this direction. Hopefully, it will bear fruit soon. However, at the UN level and at the CBD and the UNFCCC level, these mechanisms need to be substantially reformed to make it easier for all actors to access climate and nature finance.
Thanks a lot, Kaseb. You said something very interesting, and I want to pick up with Julia Galbiati from the Food and Agricultural Agency of the UN. Julia, is Julia there?
Yes.
Hi, Julia. Hi. So, Julia, in your work, you're doing a lot of the coordination work with the FAST and the Harmonia initiatives that came out of COP27 and COP29, respectively, and this emphasis on the role of multilateral development banks, of agricultural public development banks, in improving financial access to farmers. How can these institutions, in your experience, contribute to shaping a new climate finance goal that explicitly integrates agri-food systems?
Thanks, James. Yeah, the Food and Agriculture for Sustainable Transformation, the FAST partnership, it's really aims to be a space for discussion on how to improve the quantity and the quality of climate finance for agri-food systems. And you mentioned how agri-food systems are important in the global context. But at the same time, we know that they receive nowhere near the level of climate finance that they would need. There was now a CPI report that found out that only 4.3% of total climate finance actually goes to agri-food systems. And this is a very dramatic situation. And as you know, I completely agree also with what Azib was saying, that if reaching the goal means that we need to make sure that a big part of the finance that is provided is in terms of grants and highly concessional finance. But we also know that, for reaching the 300 billion goal and even more to reach the 1.3 trillion goal, we need to look into really other also innovative finance solutions. So what we do in the partnership that now counts 41 members and 10 observers is really trying to offer a space where these discussions can happen. And earlier this year in January, actually, the board members of the partnership welcomed the Harmonia initiative as a flagship program under the FAST. And among the 3 pillars of Harmonia is really building stronger collaboration between MDBs, multilateral development banks, and agri-PDBs, agricultural public development banks, to make sure to develop synergy. And another pillar of Harmonia is also empowering farmers, and in particular women and youth, because as also Zip was mentioning, it's crucial then to keep farmers at the center of these discussions. Now, specifically on the work on MDBs and agri-PDBs, we know that MDBs play a critical role as providers of climate-related development finance. In 2022, DAC members and MDBs provided 46% and 45% of climate-related development finance to agri-food systems. And the World Bank alone was the single largest resource partner to agri-food systems. So they do play an extremely critical role. Now, they will play also a big role in actually reaching the 300 billion goal. And the discussions about enhancing collaboration with agri-PDBs is really trying to leverage the complementary strengths of the two and create some innovative mechanism to mobilize climate finance that can improve direct access to finance to farmers. For example, linking the capacities of MDBs with the local knowledge and capillarity of reach that agri-PDBs have, that MDBs don't necessarily have. At the same time, there is the need then to align the capacities of agri-PDBs to be able to make them as entities that can actually receive funding from multilateral development banks, but also the financial mechanism under the UNFCCC, so that they can receive the concessional or highly favorable terms of capital, and then they can return it with flexible credit term to local projects. Because we know that for farmers, there is the need of specific financial tools in order to be able to implement sustainable agricultural practices at farm level. So that needs to be reflected in specialized funding tools that can really support this action. Now, these discussions are already happening in other contexts, but the let's say a new point is that with the Harmonia initiative, this discussion are now happening also in the climate finance agenda at COP. So we're using the FAST partnership as the COP to COP mechanism to make sure that these kind of discussions keep their momentum. And for example, this year we're organizing a workshop here in FAO that will bring together MDBs, agri-PDBs, and farmers organizations to try to really identify synergies and successful practices to scale up this kind of innovative solution for finance. Again, if we want to reach the 300 billion and 1.3 trillion goal, there is really the need to find this kind of innovative solutions. And we think that putting effort in this particular angle could help support this process.
Thanks a lot, Julia. Let me bring in Pedro now, who's a researcher, who's a team leader and a senior researcher at the Alliance of Biodiversity International, CIAR, because we've been talking a lot about what should be. Pedro, I want to maybe bring you in to talk about if you can share with us some of the effective climate adaptation initiatives that have reached, where funds have reached farmers, and what the key lessons that we can draw on from the successes to inform the design and implementation of the Baku and Belém roadmap. Pedro.
Thank you very much, James, and good afternoon or good morning to everyone who's on the call. So, I mean, there are several initiatives and projects that have been developed specifically targeting climate change adaptation and mitigation through the different financial mechanisms of the UNFCCC. that do display examples of finance that actually reaches to smallholder farmers. But not only through the financial mechanisms, there are also examples through projects being delivered by the MDBs that also show different ways in which certain financial tools can be utilized by smallholder farmers. You do find examples such as a project in Namibia called Empower to Adapt, where a resilient grant facility was developed to actually support communities and farmers in terms of being able to implement climate smart agriculture interventions, but also to put in place ecosystem management practices. And this resilient grant facility provided the finance for farmers to be able to actually implement those practices, but also it helped them, of course, reach quite interesting outcomes out of the project overall in general. So we're talking about 7.2 million hectares of improved management practices. That shows sort of the scale that this had of impact in terms of adaptation. Through the activities on ecosystem management, there was about 7.3 million tons of CO2 emissions avoided. So you can actually see how when this finance has channels to directly reach farmers, that it can actually have quite significant impact. In South Africa, a similar facility was developed, a small grants facility that was looking more at both climate smart agriculture, but also water related intervention and mainly rainwater harvesting. And you do find other examples. The World Bank has been in Kenya, Guinea, implementing their locally led climate action project. For example, in Kenya, where specifically we are supporting some of this work that the World Bank is doing through the accelerating impacts of climate smart agriculture in Africa project, where we do see counties specifically being able to access funds through the county government, from the national treasury, specifically for climate change related projects. So on an annual basis, the communities will put together project proposals, submit that through the counties, and then the counties themselves will then apply to the fund at the national level. And then this will then trickle down to support actually implementation of these different community projects. These are some of the examples which we see actually effectively getting money to the ground. Examples which definitely can help to inform different mechanisms, different reforms that need to happen to make sure that actually farmers at the local level are being able to directly access and to directly be impacted by the climate finance that is coming into the country. It is important, of course, to remember that with these different opportunities, it is important to make sure that we're making sure that what is being channeled are concessional loans. If we're looking at sort of the cost of capital that is involved in some of these investments, and that these are not, of course, creating any additional debt burden. As you saw from what I mentioned, a lot of these different facilities are grant-based facilities. And I believe that in itself, especially when we're looking at the Paris Agreement and the concept of making sure that there is sustainable development and progress towards poverty eradication, these become very, very important and key if we're talking about actual financing that needs to reach smallholder farmers to guarantee food security. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Pedro. So you seem to be, there's a lot of emphasis from what you're saying. One, about communities coming together and using the public structures to be able to get that money, and I think that's something that's come up a couple of times now. And the second one is the grant-based. If I could just go back to Hassan again, and just touch upon your work and how your work in different countries and regions, and what do you see as the most critical barriers facing small-scale farmers, and how should the NCQG Baku roadmap address these gaps? Hassan.
Thank you. Yes, I mentioned some of those points in my answer to the first question, but I wanted to also quickly remind that farmers are not inactive. Farmers already invest. In one case study of a few countries, it was estimated that about 368 or 370 billions is annually invested by farmers themselves, and this money comes from their own savings, from the community saving mechanisms that they have put in place, and other sources, private sources. So they already invest in climate resilience agriculture and climate change mitigation practices using their own sources. And as Pedro mentioned, of course, there are local initiatives, there are national level programs that provide finance, whether it's in terms of grants, micro loans, or other forms of finance to farmers. Also from private sources, finance does go to farmers. However, when we look at the NCQG and we look at the international climate finance mechanisms of structure, it is still very hard for farmers to access to the large pots of money. As we know, farmers are well organized. There are hundreds of farmer organizations around the world with millions and tens of hundreds of millions of members. They are well established. They have their own structures, their own management boards, and their own processes, and they have proven that they can handle big amounts of money, and they can effectively manage those and make sure that money is well spent. But even these well-established farmer organizations still cannot access these big pots of money, whether it's in the GCF or GEF. I know World Bank does work a lot with farmers, and they implement a lot of projects. IFAD, they work a lot with farmers, FAO. All these organizations were mostly intermediaries. They are accredited agencies. They get the money from GEF and GCF and then implement a lot of projects. And then some of those, again, farmers are included in the some level, for example, in the implementation of activities that they plan, but they don't sit in, for example, decision-making bodies of these big projects where money is. They don't have a lot of agency in how projects are designed and where the money should be spent. And to address that, they need to be able to submit their own large project proposals to GEF and GCF. But again, there are barriers. They cannot do that because of the way the GEF and GCF are established, and the structures they have. They need to meet certain criteria that they don't. They are not accredited agencies yet, and they cannot be accredited agencies because if you want to be accredited agency of GEF, GCF, you need to fulfill certain criteria that these farmer organizations cannot at the moment. And they need a technical support and expertise to develop these concept notes and project proposals, for example, modeling climate change mitigation impacts of those activities, or detailed breakdown of those costs and benefits for the activities they plan. So a lot of these need capacity and technical expertise that farmers don't universally have, which also acts as a barrier for them to even if they were to submit a proposal, they could not all submit such comprehensive proposals as required from GEF and GCF, for example. So for NCQG to learn from this is, I think, one, like I mentioned, we and the UNFCCC and CBD and countries themselves need to really rethink how they can reform these mechanisms to make them more accessible. We know that these mechanisms were set a while back, and they have never been really comprehensively reformed. And it is up to the member countries of the UN and these mechanisms to come together and make a decision to reform them. Or we can also set up separate, more accessible finance mechanisms at the regional level for farmers and specifically for agriculture and food system to make to make finance flow more easily and faster to different region and national and countries in different regions. Those two, so restructuring or reforming the CBD, GIF and GCF and the CBD and UNFCCC or Paris Agreement, or setting up a new mechanism. And these are all on the table for NCQG. And this is the time to really push for these reforms or new kinds of finance mechanisms and new ideas, innovative finance instruments, whether it's public-private types of finance instruments or concessional loans. And it is, again, like I said in the beginning, up to us also to provide this input and send a message to COP presidency, both COP29 and COP30, to take this seriously. And as we saw in the recent decision, the final decision from CBD, COP 16.1, if you want to call it, in Rome, there they actually include a point on reforming GEF, for example, the Global Environment Facility, and they make a point on making biodiversity or nature finance from GEF being more easily accessible by indigenous peoples and local communities, which I believe include farmers, for example. So the ball is moving and there is momentum, and we can definitely influence the processes, but we need to get together and have a unified voice, and that should much of that should come from farmers themselves and their representatives, but also civil society and other private sector actors to make NCQG more accessible and equitable for food system transformation in general, but specifically or more particularly for farmers around the world.
Thanks a lot, Seb. Let me go back to Pedro. I'm looking at the comments in the left by Luisa Volpe from the World Farmers Organization, picking up the same question that farmers are always treated as recipients, beneficiaries, and not co-owners. Is an element of. And Julia was speaking a little bit about as well about bringing in agricultural public development banks. I'd like to bring back Pedro for a moment. Pedro, it seems like a lot of this is about the missing middle. There's a sense, or at least that's what we're led to believe, that the agriculture sector is riskier, and we need the risk assessment tools and the finance mechanisms which need to be better aligned to those risk assessment tools to make the roadmap more predictable and accessible for locally led climate mitigation and adaptation in agriculture. What is your research findings? What are they telling you in terms of how we can better integrate these risk assessment tools and overcome what is the missing middle to be able to have finance to go more directly to the groups that need it?
So, I mean, we've seen in various cases where bringing in climate risk assessment has actually helped to develop financial tools that are more fit for purpose. It can be fit for purpose, of course, in one way, but then, of course, you do see different impacts and effects on the ground, I understand. But the bringing in of weather risk insurance or index insurance as a tool to actually directly provide funding to farmers to recover from shocks has been one of them. There has been some work that has been done in terms of bringing, for example, climate risk assessments to actually improve credit products, to allow for banks to better adjust their portfolios, making them more comfortable to be able to invest season to season. So there are some experiences that definitely can be brought about to showcase how climate risk assessments can actually help to bring together more finance. But this, of course, needs to be coupled together with sort of a socioeconomic impact assessment as well, looking at the different impacts that climate change will have across value chains, across systems, so that then we can also target better the different adaptation and mitigation solutions that you're going to finance. Bringing in these different tools do help in making sure that also the finance that is being delivered is effective. But it is important to understand other critical points here, and I think that Hasib has alluded to the challenges that do exist in accessing climate finance overall and in general. There is a lot of bureaucracy in the processes. The amounts themselves that some of the climate funds have as sort of their minimum amounts or accreditation level amounts that are in place right now do come with stringent requirements that smallholder farmers, cooperatives, and other associations, even in case some local NGOs are not able to meet those fiduciary standards that are required for them to actually, one, be accredited to manage the finance itself. So here we need to begin thinking of how we can actually solve that, and this is thinking that is starting to sort of flow in the sense that looking at examples such as the Global Environmental Facilities Small Grants Initiative that tries to develop funding for different innovations that involve the private sector that are of smaller amounts. That are accessed a lot easier than are the normal processes, right? So looking at experiences like these to actually streamline those processes across the other funds would be something very interesting to see, because then it actually helps to unlock finance for those small and medium enterprises, for the cooperatives, to fund different innovations on the ground. But we're talking at the end of the day of a much larger scale as well, but at least making sure that those funds can directly reach those who need it is also important. I think that, the goal in itself, right, and just sort of just providing my take on the overall outcome of the decision. The outcome that was reached of the 300 billion, it's important to note, of course, that just with the MDB reforms that we're talking about, the MDB reforms themselves estimate to unlock about 250 billion on their own. So technically speaking, we're saying that without any additional effort and with simply reforming the current MDB system, we should be able to channel already an additional 250 billion. So that leaves to question exactly what does need to come into the $1.3 trillion overarching goal that needs to be contributed by all actors. There are a lot of conversations around trying to see whether maybe the commitment that's already within the NCQG of the 300 billion, whether all of that should go to adaptation. These are things that are in question. Whether of the 1.3 trillion, the 650 billion, half the amount, whether that should be coming from the private sector. But then how do we leverage the private sector? How do we bring them in? Because if we also think about reaching the communities on the ground, private sector actually has a very big role to play there, right? Because they're the ones who are in the middle of the value chains, sourcing their produce from farmers, that they are the main point where employment comes in. So it is important for us to also look at the bigger picture of things and see what role other aspects will have to play. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Pedro. Actually, Pedro, you picked up on the 1.3 trillion, but there's another 1.3 trillion figure, which is just for climate finance for agri-food systems alone. And then the FAO's triple gap in finance for agri-food systems. I'd like to bring Julia back in here. Julia, what specific mechanisms should be prioritized for that agri-food systems, particularly smallholder farmers, receive enough financing under this new goal? And when you answer that, when I was looking at the triple gap in finance report, I was struck by the fact that of the 1.3 trillion that the report recommends is needed for agri-food systems, it's saying that I think it's 480 billion is needed for policies and incentives. So maybe taking that into account, because I think that's one of the big issues that Pedro and Hasib have sort of alluded to when they're speaking about what is it that's needed that's going to bring the private sector in. And I think it's probably around the enabling environment and particularly around policies and incentives. So if you could sort of maybe go, what are those mechanisms that need to be prioritized, Julia?
Absolutely. So priorities in general, I think whenever we're discussing goals for climate finance is that aspects of quantity and quality of finance should really go hand in hand in any discussion. Now, the report that you're mentioning actually takes also what was said at the very beginning of the webinar, when we mentioned that the 1.3 trillion is actually the goal that is more in line with what is needed. And even that might be an underestimation. In fact, in the report that you're mentioning, the triple gap in finance for agri-food systems that was published by FAO and CPI, we took a top-down and a bottom-up approach to try to understand really what is the actual need. And from a top-down approach, so just trying to understand what are the real costs of the activities that needs to be done to make sure that agri-food systems stay on a 1.5 pathway. Only their investments range around the 1 billion annually until 2030. And if we look instead from the bottom-up approach, so how much actually governments so far have been costing the activity in their NDCs, that goes to 201 billion annually up to 2030. So here we are seeing what in the report is referred to as a planning gap. So there is a very high underestimation of which activities are needed. And that is one very important aspect in attracting finance, because we have to make sure that agri-food systems are adequately represented in national strategy documents in order to be able to attract investments, because that is a key indication of the importance that these systems have in a way to really combating climate change. So the aspect of the importance of having agri-food systems adequately represented in NDCs, but also adequately costed, is a very important planning aspect that needs to be considered, and that is the basis really for then discussions about attracting finance. I think another important aspect that needs to be considered as a mechanism here is really what was mentioned also before about the fact that the NCQG at the moment does not set a goal for grants and highly concessional finance, which is key, again, to support especially least developed countries. So we have to make sure that the discrepancy between access to grants and to loans, even of concessional term, is not really exacerbated by this new sort of funding cycle. Other maybe mechanisms that I can mention to ensure that agri-food systems get the right climate finance definitely are what's been mentioned. Equity and inclusivity. These are really the pillars of the quality of finance. Sustainability, so financing actions that can really strengthen communities' resilience and capacities. And also what we have to look at is long-term stable funding that can really yield then the adoption of sustainable agricultural practices. So these I think are the areas along the quantity of finance, of the quality of finance, and that can really be something that then brings in investments that have a longer term or more sustainable view also.
Thanks a lot, Julia. So I think now what I've got, Sebi wants to come in, but before you come in, I've got a question here, and I'd like to encourage everybody to throw their questions in the chat from Sirush Babu, who's asking, has there been a typology of countries or agri-systems that are mapped to climate finance and agriculture? Climate investment plans are based on NDC revisions that could be targeted to build capacity for accessing climate funds both internally and externally. This process still depends on external technical assistance in several vulnerable countries, including Nepal and Bangladesh. Is there anybody know anything about the mapping of climate finance needs around typologies of countries and agri-systems? I presume that's got to do with similarities and possibilities for bringing together types of technical assistance questions that are needed for different agri-food systems.
If I may, I'm not aware of such a typology that's been mapped against climate finance and climate finance needs, but as Julia mentioned in the Triple Gap report and also the sources that the Triple Gap report cites, there have been cost estimates for different types of activities that we need to implement for food system transformation, whether it's, for example, addressing drivers of ecosystem conversion in agriculture, whether it is supporting resilience of local communities and farmers, providing technical assistance to farmers, knowledge sharing, or whether it is creating safety nets for farmers and farming communities and so on. But that's not mapped against the different types of food systems, I must say, and I'm not aware. But when it comes to NDCs, and that's why I raised my hand, I think that's a great point that Julia mentioned about making NDCs more clear and investable. Right now, there's a lot of ambiguity and clarity on what kinds of activities the countries are planning for climate mitigation adaptation in agriculture and food systems as part of their NDCs, and what kinds of outcome they are anticipating from those activities, and what are the costs of implementing those activities. Some NDCs do a better job of doing that than others, but definitely there's a huge gap there. And at the same time, even from privates, not only these MDBs, but also private sector actors are increasingly seeing or looking at NDC as the place where they can find where to invest their money, where to send their money for food, agriculture, energy, transport, any sectors. So the more we have clarity on what we can do at the national level in agriculture and food system and include that as part of NDC, the likelihood to attract more finance increases. But when it comes to smallholder farmers or family farmers, I think it's important that indigenous people and local communities, that they are part of this NDC developing and implementation process. Again, right now, they are not included meaningfully or effectively or in all countries or all NDC processes. So to make NDCs invisible, but in a way that supports farmers and improves food system sustainability, we need to again bring in farmers in this NDC or national adaptation process or the national strategies and action plans under the CBD and GBF, the NBSAPs that I'm talking about. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. And I see Julia have her hand up to come back in. You're muted.
No, I just wanted to mention that one important aspect of having clear NDCs and of course inclusive NDCs that really take everyone's in when setting the targets is that we have to remember that we still do not have a definition of climate finance, and that financing NDCs is like the best proxy that we have so far in understanding what climate finance is. So that's why it is extremely important to have clear NDCs, that we have clear actions for agri-food systems that are costed as well. And so that we can really use NDCs then to develop investment plans at country level, because that's really the best proxy we have now for a definition of climate finance and knowing what can be actually financed with those resources.
Hi, and I've got one more question in. Pedro, maybe I can give this question to you or you can integrate. I've got one question here from Aditi Mukherjee, who's the Climate Platform Director at CGIAR. Can any of the speakers give an idea about which subcomponents of agri-food systems is seeing the most amount of investments? And is the supply of funds to various subcomponents of the food system consummate to their emissions? Pedro.
All right, so this isn't something that I've looked into in a lot of detail, but I mean, most of the projects that I've seen being financed are around the production area, because we're looking at incentivizing more the use of sustainable practices when it comes to the transformation that we're looking to do in the agri-food systems overall and in general. It has been the main piece for a long time, when we're talking about climate smart agriculture, conservation agriculture, bringing in more drought tolerant seeds. But I know that maybe Julia might have a specific answer on that, because also FAO has been doing a lot of work around tracking finance specifically for food systems, and definitely have that breakdown. But what I was going to touch upon a little bit was still on Babu's question around the investment planning pieces to the different climate policy documents that are out there. And he touches on a point that's very important, right? The fact that there is a lot of reliance on external technical assistance to actually be able to develop those investment plans. Julia mentioned something that is critical and that is becoming more important and serious over time, which is the issue around the costing of the priorities for the agriculture sector when it comes to the development of different climate strategies. So we're talking both around the NDCs and NAPs, but even in the local level climate plans. It is an exercise that can be either very technically heavy, but there are examples of countries that have done much simpler processes to provide high-level estimates at least. But we do want more investable NDCs. So costing, of course, is not the only issue that we need to look at. One thing that is hardly ever mentioned is the fact that we not only need to cost, but we actually need to associate different investments with the appropriate financing tools, especially if we're thinking about how to bring in the private sector. So we need to make sure that as we're developing these new climate strategies, that we're also putting in the building blocks for the private sector to know exactly what their entry points are. Splitting this between, of course, the tools that are relevant for mitigation, the financial tools that are relevant for adaptation, but also, maintaining the fact that, there are other components that need to be thought of in terms of CBRD and other CBDR and other concepts. But so that's it from my side.
Thanks a lot, Pedro, and thanks a lot to everybody, because if I want to pass over now to Carol Franco-Villini. Carol is an environmental advisor at the Ministry of Environment in the Dominican Republic, a country which is quite vulnerable, I think, to climate impacts, particularly in the agricultural sector. And Carol's also a member of the board of the Food and Agriculture for Sustainable Transformation Initiative from COP27. So, Carol, what I'd like to hand over to you for some reflections on your side from what you've heard, but also from the climate finance issue in general.
Thank you so much, James. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. And I would like to start by thanking our speakers and for the valuable contributions and providing us with a deeper understanding of the challenges and opportunity within the evolving climate finance landscape. I wanted to provide, more than anything, a summary of what we spoke today and all the contributions from the different speakers and some messages that we can carry on with us. So today's webinar has provided a comprehensive overview of the new Collective Quantified Goal, one of the most pivotal outcomes of COP29 in Baku, commitment from developed nations to mobilize 300 billion annually by 2035, and the broader goal of scaling total financing to 1.3 trillion per year. This represents a significant step forward in global climate finance. However, as many stakeholders have pointed out, as many speakers have pointed out, these commitments still fall short of the estimated 1.3 trillion needed annually by 2030 to effectively address all the impacts of climate change and adaptation and mitigation needs. So this raises fundamental questions about the effectiveness, accessibility, and equitable distribution of climate finance. How do we ensure that the funds are reaching the communities and sectors that need them the most? How can we reduce the existing barriers faced by farmers, which we spoke a little bit today about? How do we bridge the persistent gap between pledges and real on-the-ground implementation? These are some of those pressing challenges that will define the road ahead, and they will require concerted efforts from policymakers, financial institutions, but also civil society alike. One of the most critical aspects we have explored today is the role of food and agriculture sector within the NCQG framework. As we have discussed, agriculture is both significant contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions and one of the most vulnerable sectors to climate change. And that is the case for the Dominican Republic. Yes, as highlighted in the Public Climate Finance for Food Systems Transformation report, agri-food systems often remain underrepresented in climate finance mechanisms. This, of course, must change. If we are serious about achieving a sustainable and resilient future, we must ensure that financial flows adequately support sustainable agroecological food systems. Investments must prioritize smallholder farmers, indigenous communities, and local adaptation initiatives. So during this webinar, we heard various initiatives and financial mechanisms that have demonstrated also that climate finance can effectively reach smallholders, farmers, but there's a lot we still need to do. And today's discussion we have seen is that there's a critical need for improve access to climate finance for small-scale farmers by reforming financial mechanisms and reducing bureaucratic barriers, reform existing finance structures to make them more accessible, or establish new dedicated mechanisms tailored for agriculture and food systems at regional levels. Strengthen public-private partnerships to mobilize both public and private sector investments in agri-food systems, remembering that the private sector will also play a key role in reaching communities on the ground. Leverage multilateral development banks and agri-PDBs to drive inclusive and sustainable finance mechanisms. Integrate risk assessment tools into climate finance strategies to ensure funding mechanisms are aligned with the realities of agriculture systems and climate resilient needs. And alongside climate risk assessments, also remember to use socioeconomic impact assessments, which are essential to ensure that adaptation and mitigation solutions are effectively targeted. Provide grant-based concessional finance is key to avoid debt burdens on farmers while fostering sustainable development, and adequately represent and cost agri-food systems in national climate strategies like the NDCs to enhance access to funding. So looking ahead, as we look toward COP30 in Belém, Brazil, the focus will shift to defining a concrete implementation strategy for the NCQG, the Baku to Belém Roadmap to 1.3 trillion. This roadmap must not only ensure that funds are mobilized at scale, but also that they are distributed equitably and effectively used to drive transformative climate action. So some final thoughts in closing today's conversation. Has reinforced that while progress has been made, there's still much to be done. The NCQG represents an opportunity to reshape climate finance, but it will require all of us, governments, financial institutions, civil society, researchers, academia, to push for ambitious, inclusive, and actionable strategies that leave no one behind. Thank you again to all the speakers for today's webinar.